Everyone said grief makes you see things, but I wasn't hallucinating when that door swung open. My grandfather had been buried less than 12 hours earlier, and there she stood, hands on hips, eyes sharp as nails, storming into a home that had been in my family for 150 years. She didn't knock. She didn't pause. She just walked in as though Harold's study belonged to her. And in that moment, I realized the morning wasn't even over, but the war had already begun. "You can't just inherit land and do whatever you want with it," she snapped, voice carrying the false authority of a school principal scolding a child. Clipboard in one hand, arrogance in the other. She didn't know it yet, but I wasn't just Harold's grandson. I was the governor of this state, and she'd just committed trespassing against the wrong family. The smell of pine and leather still clung to the hallway, Harold's boots lined neatly by the door where he'd left them last. My suit was still wrinkled from the funeral. My heart was heavy, fragile. But the sight of this HOA president barging in with codes and violations spilling from her mouth replaced grief with something hotter. Rage. She looked around the room as if she owned it. The photographs of Harold with his cattle, the folded flag from his army service, the shelves of law books older than her subdivision. She sat in Harold's reading chair without asking, flipping pages on her clipboard like she was conducting an inspection. And I swear, for a moment, I wondered if this was some kind of sick prank. "Mr. Grant, I'm Olivia Sharp, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association," she said. "I'm here to discuss immediate compliance issues before your property lowers our community values." Compliance? That word struck me harder than a hammer, because this land had never belonged to Meadowbrook Estates. It was ours before their cookie-cutter houses were even an idea. The deed, signed in 1875, sat in Harold's desk drawer. My great-great-grandfather carved out these acres with his bare hands while Meadowbrook was still wheat fields, yet this woman thought she had authority here. Her first demand, the porch swing. Harold built it himself in 1952, a place where he'd sit at dawn sipping coffee, waiting for the cattle to stir. "Remove it," she ordered. "It doesn't match subdivision standards." Her second, the oak tree by the gate. My family planted it in 1923, a living memorial for surviving the Spanish flu. She wanted it trimmed to maintain sight lines. And then came the third, the one that made my stomach turn cold. "The family cemetery in your west pasture must be relocated within 60 days. I stared at her, silent, disbelieving. She had just ordered me to dig up my grandfather's grave, fresh soil still turned, along with generations of Grant family history to protect aesthetics. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't about flowers, fences, or porch swings. This was an invasion. I leaned back, met her eyes, and said quietly, "I should probably mention I'm Governor Grant." Her face barely flickered, a blink maybe two, then she shrugged, continuing as if I'd told her my favorite TV show. "Governor or not, you're subject to the same community guidelines as everyone else." That confidence, the kind that comes from never facing consequences, made me almost laugh. She spoke of delegated state authority. Yet I was the state authority, and she had just declared war on land she had no right to touch. I pulled the deed from Harold's desk, laid it across the wood. Survey maps from 1875. Historic agricultural protections signed by preservation boards. She glanced at them for 10 seconds, dismissed them with a smirk. Paper to her meant nothing. Only control mattered. And still something in Harold's safe called to me. He'd written in his will that inside lay documents for emergencies. He knew. Somehow he'd anticipated this fight. I escorted her out, though escorted feels too kind. More like dragging arrogance back to her sedan, where she sat in the driveway for 15 minutes, making phone calls, glaring at the ranch like she was planning an assault. That night, I stood by the window, Harold's shotgun leaning against the wall, watching her taillights fade into the dark. My grandfather used to say, "Good fences make good neighbors." But fences mean nothing when your neighbor believes she owns everything on the other side. The cameras Harold installed years ago hummed to life, recording every angle of her intrusion. And as I stared at the blinking red light, one thought echoed in my chest. This wasn't the end. It was only the opening move. Sometimes loss shows you who the wolves are. And that night I realized the fight for Harold's ranch had just begun. The first time I saw them, I thought maybe I was dreaming. Two silhouettes at the west fence line just after dawn, moving slow, steady like men who'd been here before. But binoculars don't lie. Wire cutters glinted in their hands and survey equipment rode on their shoulders. They weren't trespassers looking for mischief. They were working, Methodical, precise, as if following a script written by someone who knew exactly how to wound a ranch. My phone buzzed before I even had time to react. A message from an unknown number. Property correction crew working today. Do not interfere. 60-day compliance deadline remains. My stomach turned. Olivia hadn't just threatened me with her clipboard. She'd hired men, real crews, and she was arrogant enough to text me proof. I pressed record on the security system Harold had installed. Top of the line, wide angle, audio sharp enough to hear a whisper across a field. Every movement, every clipped strand of barbed wire, every muttered instruction was captured. And what I heard made my blood freeze. Focus on the sections near the old cemetery first, one of them said. That's what she wants. The cemetery, my grandfather's grave, my great-great-grandfather's, my family. The place where Harold had placed the same oak bench she'd tried to claim as HOA property. She wanted it destroyed first, not because it was an eyesore, but because she understood what it meant. She was targeting bloodlines, memory, dignity. For a moment, anger almost pushed me out the door with Harold's shotgun in my hands. But Harold's voice echoed in my mind. Don't waste bullets when paperwork can do the job cleaner. So instead, I called Owen, my chief counsel. And I blind copied a journalist I trusted, someone who'd exposed corrupt city officials 2 years back. If Olivia thought intimidation would work, she hadn't yet realized she was dealing with a governor who believed sunlight is the best disinfectant. Through the binoculars, I watched the men dismantle 400 feet of Harold's fence. Not sloppy, surgical. They stacked posts neatly, rolled the wire into clean coils. This wasn't vandalism, it was sabotage with an invoice attached. Their truck bore the name Meadowbrook Property Services. Bold or stupid, maybe both. By noon, they were gone, leaving behind wreckage that wasn't just wood and metal. It was history, cut and left bleeding on the soil. I spent the rest of the day duplicating footage, packaging evidence, labeling each clip with GPS coordinates and timestamps. The legal team was ready to file charges immediately. My phone burned with Owen's voice. Governor, this is conspiracy. We can have warrants in 2 hours. But I hesitated, not because I doubted the law, but because I knew Olivia. If we arrested her now, we'd cut the head off one snake, but snakes travel in nests, and I wanted every last one of them exposed. That night I sat in Harold's study, safe key in my hand, staring at the steel box he'd left behind. My grandfather never locked things unless he expected a storm. Inside were documents yellowed by time but sharper than any blade Olivia could wield, letters from state preservation boards, federal agricultural protections, correspondence with the Attorney General himself. Harold had seen this fight coming long before I was ready for it, and he'd built a fortress of law around his land. But Olivia, she wasn't backing down. At midnight, motion alerts buzzed again. Her white sedan rolled past the west fence, headlights sweeping across the broken posts. She stopped, climbed out, clipboard in hand, snapping photos of the damage she herself had ordered. She was documenting her own crime scene, like a child drawing her name on the wall she just scribbled with crayons. I realized then this wasn't just arrogance, this was obsession. Neighbors began whispering, too. Ella Dawson, a middle school teacher, called me 2 days later. Her voice shook, not with fear but with anger sharpened by months of quiet harassment. Olivia had fined her for growing tomatoes in her backyard, demanded she rip out her peppers and herbs because they weren't aesthetic. Another neighbor had been told to take down his father's fishing photos from a shed. Someone else was ordered to remove their flag. She wasn't just after me, she was after everyone. My ranch was simply the crown jewel she wanted to claim. And here's the truth about power. It doesn't rot communities overnight. It seeps in little by little, until one day you wake up and realize the tyrant next door has been rewriting the rules to suit her whims. That night, Harold's oak tree whispered in the wind outside my window, branches older than her entire subdivision. And I promised him I wouldn't just defend the ranch. I'd expose her, root and stem, until her empire of lies collapsed under its own weight. Because sometimes the most dangerous criminals aren't hiding in alleys. They're smiling at HOA meetings, holding clipboards. And Olivia Sharp had just stepped into the fight of her life. The courthouse smelled of old wood and rain-soaked coats, but to me it felt like a battlefield. Papers instead of rifles, judges instead of generals, and Olivia Sharp, though she didn't know it yet, was about to lose her first war. Governor Grant, the clerk said softly, eyes widening when she realized who stood before her. Most governors don't show up in person for restraining orders. But this wasn't just political. This was blood, soil, legacy, and I wanted to look that judge in the eye when he signed the papers. Our evidence spread across the desk like ammunition. Time-stamped footage of men cutting fences, audio of them mentioning the cemetery, texts from Olivia documenting her conspiracy in her own words. If evidence was weight, she was already crushed beneath it. Judge Morrison had seen property disputes before, but as the footage played, Olivia's crew calmly dismantling 400 feet of Harold's fence, joking about starting with the graves, his face tightened. His gavel came down harder than thunder. Miss Sharp is hereby prohibited from any contact with Governor Grant's person, property, or family members, he ruled. Violation will result in immediate arrest. Just like that, the law was on my side, but if Olivia felt defeat, she didn't show it. When the deputy served her the restraining order later that evening, she didn't look rattled, didn't even blink. She tapped her clipboard like a poker player holding a losing hand and bluffing anyway. "You sure you want to do this?" she asked. "Some fights don't end with paperwork." The deputy's words were firm, professional. "Miss Sharp, any violation means handcuffs." But as I watched her, I saw it in her eyes. She wasn't done. If anything, the paper in her hands was gasoline on a fire. That night, Harold's safe whispered answers I hadn't wanted to hear. Decades of correspondence, preservation statutes, attorney general memos. Harold had been preparing for this very storm, stockpiling legal defenses like a soldier stacking sandbags before a flood. He knew people like Olivia would come, and he wanted me ready. Still, preparation doesn't soften the sting when you see tire tracks where no car should be. The morning after the order, my phone buzzed with another alert. The cameras caught Olivia's sedan circling the ranch, stopping at the west gate, snapping more photographs. Each click was another violation, each violation another nail in her coffin. By midnight, she had broken the order 17 times, all caught in high definition, all stamped with GPS data. And then I saw it, the small orange flag, stuck in the dirt just feet from Harold's grave, a bright marker against dark soil, a promise of what she intended. I called Deputy Martinez. "Governor, we can arrest her right now," he said. "She's stacked up contempt charges most criminals don't collect in a lifetime." But I hesitated because I knew something else was happening. The neighbors were stirring. Ella called again, but this time she wasn't alone. Her voice was stronger, backed by dozens. She'd been quietly documenting Olivia's harassment of the entire subdivision. Flower boxes ordered removed, work vans fined, flags banned, families threatened with fees for violations that didn't exist anywhere in county code. And now they weren't whispering anymore. They were meeting, gathering, sharing stories in living rooms and garages, building something Olivia had never prepared for: unity. I drove past Ella's house that Thursday night. 30 cars lined the streets, headlights cutting through the dark. Through her window, I saw neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder, papers in hand, anger in their eyes. They weren't afraid anymore. They were tired of being bullied. And in that moment, I realized Olivia's mistake. She thought she was fighting me, one man, one ranch, but her arrogance had infected an entire community. And now they were waking up. Still, arrogance makes people bold. Olivia slipped newsletters under doors the very next morning, calling for a mandatory compliance meeting. Not a conversation, a purge. Harold's oak swayed heavy in the wind that night as I stood on the porch, papers in my hand, shotgun by the door. She was daring me, daring all of us, to challenge her kingdom of clipboards and threats. And I knew this wasn't just about fences anymore, or swings, or graves. This was about power, the kind people abuse when no one stands up, the kind that rots neighborhoods from the inside. But Olivia had made one fatal mistake. She chose to test a governor who'd buried his grandfather only to inherit both a ranch and a war. And this time she wouldn't just face me. She'd face every neighbor she'd ever silenced. Monday mornings usually bring routine, coffee, headlines, and the hum of ranch chores. But that Monday, my chief of staff knocked on my office door with an expression I'll never forget. Half grave, half electric, the look a man wears when news could either save you or sink you. "Governor, we've got someone downstairs asking for a deal," he whispered. "Name, Martin Greer. He says he has information about Olivia." The name meant nothing to me. But when Martin walked into my conference room, I recognized the type instantly. Expensive suit, nervous smile. the polished charm of a man who made a career consulting for developers, and the sweaty hands of someone whose empire was collapsing. "I want to be transparent, Governor," Martin began, laying out files like a gambler showing his last hand. "Olivia hired me 6 months ago. Your ranch, was identified as the key obstacle to a resort project." He didn't flinch as he said it, didn't soften the blow. My grandfather's blood-soaked soil, the oak tree that had stood for a century, the graves in the west pasture, he reduced them to an obstacle. Martin's voice shook as he confessed. The fence cutting, the cemetery threats, the bogus compliance orders, all part of a coordinated plan. Olivia hadn't been improvising, she'd been executing strategy, his strategy. The goal was simple: harass me until I surrendered, then buy the ranch for pennies, flipping it to investors for a $12 million profit. They'd researched Harold's finances, convinced he couldn't survive drawn-out litigation. They didn't count on Harold passing the torch to me, or me being both governor and grandson. And then Martin said the words that chilled me to the core. If the harassment failed, Olivia wanted to escalate. We even discussed contaminating your water supply. My fists clenched. Poison, not just harassment, not just intimidation, poisoning land that had fed generations. Threatening cattle, neighbors, families, crimes that could have killed. But Martin wasn't confessing out of guilt. He was confessing out of fear. Federal investigators had started sniffing around after the restraining order went public. He wanted immunity. He wanted to flip on Olivia before she dragged him down with her. And flip he did. Recordings, meeting transcripts, emails, plans so detailed they read like blueprints for corruption. Olivia hadn't just been a rogue neighbor with too much power. She'd been the spearhead of a criminal conspiracy dressed up as community management. The irony? Martin's recordings were so thorough, so complete, it was as if he'd been building the prosecution's case while planning the crime. By the time he left my office wearing a wire for the feds, I knew Olivia was cornered. But cornered animals don't go quietly. Saturday dawned bright, blue, perfect, the kind of morning Harold loved for riding fence lines. Instead, it became a theater for madness. Guests were arriving at the ranch for Harold's memorial. Old friends, neighbors who'd stood by our family through lean years. Retired Judge Peterson, even here to honor a man whose handshake had been as solid as any legal contract. And then, like thunder rolling in on a clear sky, Olivia appeared. A rented truck screeched to a stop outside the gate. 3 men jumped out, hauling surveying stakes and measuring gear. Olivia followed, dressed in what looked like an official inspector's uniform, clipboard clutched tight. She called out across the road like she was addressing a rally. "Governor Grant, I'm here to conduct mandatory compliance inspections, as authorized by state development standards." I laughed, couldn't help it. The woman was impersonating a government official in front of witnesses on the day of my grandfather's memorial. Judge Peterson's voice cut through the air. "That sounds like federal impersonation, serious prison time." Phones rose, cameras clicked. Witnesses documented every move as Olivia's crew began driving stakes into soil that had belonged to my family since 1875. She was redrawing lines, inventing boundaries, stealing land with a smile. And then she crossed the line, literally. She stepped over the low brick ledge around Harold's memorial bench, kicked over the lilies I'd placed there days before, stabbed a flag into the dirt beside his name. "This is HOA maintained property now," she declared. Something inside me snapped. I walked down the hill, phone in hand, live streaming every second. If she wanted an audience, I'd give her one. "Step away from that memorial," I said, my voice steady but hot with fury. Her answer was to push forward, hand reaching for the bench as if to rip it from the earth. What happened next was chaos caught on 20 cameras. Olivia shoved against me, screaming about non-compliant structures. I blocked her, my body between her and Harold's memory. She wailed that I was assaulting her. Guests gasped. Phones recorded. The scene unfolded like a play written for the courtroom. "Call 911, I told Judge Peterson. Within minutes, sirens pierced the quiet hills. Patrol cars flew down the dirt road, dust kicking up behind them. Deputies leapt out, handcuffs ready. Olivia was still screaming about compliance when the metal clicked around her wrists. Her crew froze, eyes wide, as deputies dragged them aside for questioning. The oak tree swayed in the wind, its branches whispering the same truth Harold had always known. Justice may be slow, but it comes. Standing over Harold's bench, heart pounding, I realized this was only the beginning. Olivia's arrest wasn't the finale. It was the turning of a page. And the next chapter would be written not just by me, but by every neighbor she'd ever bullied. The Meadowbrook Community Center had never seen a night like this. By 6 o'clock, the parking lot looked more like a political rally than a neighborhood meeting. Cars jammed every curb, people spilled onto sidewalks, voices buzzed with anger and anticipation. Word of Olivia's arrest had spread like wildfire, and the residents she once ruled with fines and threats were now ready to look her crimes in the eye. Inside, the room was packed shoulder to shoulder. Some stood in the aisles, others pressed against the windows from outside. These weren't just Meadowbrook homeowners anymore. People had driven in from neighboring subdivisions, even other counties, drawn by whispers of an HOA scandal big enough to topple walls of silence that had trapped countless communities. Ella Dawson stood near the front, folder thick as a brick under her arm. For months she'd been collecting stories, documenting harassment, filing away every lie Olivia had wrapped in the word compliance. Now Ella wasn't just a teacher. She was the voice of a rebellion. At 7 sharp, State Attorney Rebecca Chen stepped to the podium. Her presence alone shifted the air. Known statewide for dismantling corruption and taking on organized crime, Chen didn't waste words. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying over the restless crowd. "What I'm about to present represents one of the most systematic fraud and harassment cases our office has ever prosecuted." The projector hummed to life, and then the truth hit the wall. First came Martin Greer's voice. His recorded confession played across the speakers, how Olivia had targeted my ranch, how harassment was scripted to force a sale, how investors stood ready to profit once we broke under pressure. The room went silent. Shock, then anger, then murmurs that grew into something darker, betrayal. Next came the money trail. Records of special assessments Olivia had demanded from residents, funds supposedly for drainage projects, landscaping upgrades, legal protections. But every invoice led to nowhere. Phantom companies, fake contracts, and ultimately Olivia's personal accounts. Over the past 3 years, Miss Sharp has embezzled approximately $87,000 from community funds, Attorney Chen announced. The crowd erupted in gasps. Some shouted, others cursed under their breath. Then the footage rolled. My camera's Harold's foresight. Olivia's hired men cutting fence wire, stacking posts, muttering about the cemetery. Her own voice caught in text messages ordering property corrections. Images of her trespassing, flag in hand, desecrating Harold's memorial. People covered their mouths, some wept. One man, a veteran, muttered, "She went after the dead, that's beyond evil." Ella stepped forward then, her folder slamming onto the table like a gavel. 17 families, she said, voice sharp as glass. She threatened 17 families with fake violations. She fined us for flower boxes, for vegetable gardens, for flags. She created rules that never existed, and she stole from every one of us. Applause burst out, not polite but raw, furious. Tom Bradley followed, construction documents in hand. 60% of her citations don't exist in county code, he explained. She fabricated laws, threatened lawsuits, and collected money under authority she never had. The room thundered with shouts, years of frustration pouring out all at once. And then came the text messages. Olivia planning the inspection that ended with her in handcuffs. Her words, cold and unflinching, about disrupting a family memorial, about removing benches and flowers from graves. Photos of her arrest flashed on the screen, handcuffed, still smiling like she believed the rules bent for her alone. By the time Attorney Chen closed her laptop, the crowd wasn't just angry, they were united. Jim Foster, the accountant, stood tall at the back of the room. "She's stolen over $100,000 in total," he said, waving financial sheets in his hand. "Through fraud, fake assessments, and contracts that never existed, we'll file civil suits, we'll take back every dime." The vote was unanimous. Olivia was finished. The HOA board, once her stage, was dissolved right there in that community hall. Residents cheered as Ella was chosen interim coordinator, tasked with rebuilding leadership rooted in fairness instead of tyranny. For the first time in years, people felt free. Free to plant gardens, free to fly flags, free to live without the shadow of Olivia's clipboard hanging over their doors. But freedom isn't always clean. Because as I watched neighbors hug, cry, and whisper plans for lawsuits, I knew Olivia wasn't done yet. She'd been dragged away in handcuffs, yes. Her empire crumbling, yes. But her eyes that day, bright, defiant, smiling even in defeat, told me one thing: she still believed she could win. And people like Olivia don't fade quietly. They come back louder, more desperate, more dangerous. That night, standing outside the community center under Harold's stars, I realized we weren't at the end of this story. We were only halfway through. Because Olivia Sharp wasn't finished, not by a long shot. It was just past dawn when Martin called, his voice tight, hurried, like a man who knew every word might be his last. "Governor, she's planning something big this weekend. She thinks one dramatic gesture will force you to negotiate. She wants the pressure public, loud, unavoidable." He didn't need to say more. I could already see it. Olivia standing at my gates, clipboard in hand, screaming about compliance while plotting destruction. But this time she wouldn't be alone. She would bring muscle, props, theater. She was desperate, and desperation makes people reckless. The recordings Martin handed over proved it. Hours of meetings where Olivia spelled out her tactics. Target the cemetery, cut the fences first. Drain the funds, push until he breaks. Her voice, cool and steady, mapping out crimes like they were line items on a grocery list. And then came the part that made my blood run cold. "If this doesn't work, we hit the water supply. One bad test, one contamination scare, and he won't last a month." She wasn't bluffing. This wasn't HOA theater anymore. It was attempted biological sabotage. The kind of crime that could destroy livestock, poison families, devastate an entire town. Federal agents listened with stone faces as Martin's recordings played in my office. State prosecutors scribbled notes like fire was falling from the sky. One by one, they shook their heads in disbelief. An HOA president orchestrating conspiracy on par with organized crime. "Governor," Attorney Chen said quietly, "this isn't just fraud anymore. This is federal territory, conspiracy, sabotage. We're preparing charges that carry decades in prison." And yet, Olivia carried on as if nothing had changed. Saturday arrived bright and clear. The kind of morning Harold used to say was too perfect to trust. Guests gathered for his postponed memorial, neighbors, family, even retired Judge Peterson again, all ready to honor a man whose hands had built fences stronger than steel. Then right on cue, Olivia showed up. The rental truck rumbled down the dirt road, pulling to a stop just outside the gate. 3 men jumped out, unloading surveying stakes, hammers, posts. Olivia followed, clipboard clutched like a crown, wearing an outfit meant to mimic an official inspector's uniform. She wasn't hiding anymore, she was doubling down. "Governor Grant," she shouted, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'm here to conduct mandatory compliance inspection authorized by state development standards." Gasps rippled through the guests, phones lifted, cameras rolled. Judge Peterson muttered, "That's impersonation of a government official, a felony." But Olivia didn't care. She strode to the fence, directing her crew to pound stakes into my family's soil. Each hammer strike was theft in slow motion, a violation dressed as authority. And then she did the unthinkable. She stepped over the brick border of Harold's memorial bench, kicked over the lilies I'd placed for him, stabbed her flag into the earth 2 feet from his name. "This is HOA-maintained property now," she declared, voice ringing with madness. I felt something break inside me. I walked down the hill, phone in hand, livestream on. "Say that again for the court," I told her, my voice low, sharp as barbed wire. She sneered, reaching for the bench as though she'd rip it from the ground. I blocked her path, my body between her and Harold's name. "Step away," I said. What happened next was chaos. Olivia shoved against me, shouting that I was obstructing enforcement. She screamed that the bench was non-compliant. Her hired crew froze, wide-eyed, as if realizing for the first time their employer wasn't just bending rules, she was unraveling them. Guests recorded from every angle, 20 witnesses, phones capturing every shove, every scream, every lunatic claim of authority. "Call 911, I told Judge Peterson. Minutes later, sirens split the air. 3 patrol cars, the sheriff himself, Detective Williams, the specialist for fraud cases involving false authority. Olivia was still screaming about compliance when deputies wrenched her arms behind her back and snapped handcuffs over her wrists. Her crew was detained, too, questions firing like bullets. "Who hired you? Who paid you? How long have you been working for her?" But Olivia, she just smiled. Even in cuffs, even with her inspection crumbling in front of 20 witnesses, she smiled like she was untouchable. "I'll see you at the land reassessment hearing," she whispered as they dragged her away. A hearing that didn't even exist. That night the neighbors gathered again, but this time it wasn't just anger. It was momentum, unity. Ella slammed her folder down on the table. She threatened 17 families. She stole over $100,000. She fabricated rules that don't exist. Enough is enough. Applause roared through the room. The crowd voted unanimously. Olivia Sharp was finished. The HOA board dissolved. Ella named interim coordinator, a community reborn out of ashes. And yet as cheers filled the hall, I remembered her smile. That smug, defiant smirk as the cuffs clicked shut. She believed she still had cards to play. And if I'd learned anything from Harold, it was this. The most dangerous part of a storm isn't the thunder. It's the silence right before the next strike. The trial room was colder than I expected. Not in temperature, but in atmosphere, like everyone inside had agreed this was more than a case. It was a reckoning. Olivia Sharp sat at the defense table, hair pulled back, suit pressed, a mask of composure plastered on her face. But no amount of polish could hide the reality. The woman who once wielded clipboards like weapons was now shackled by her own arrogance. The prosecution didn't waste time. They started with Martin Greer's recordings. His voice echoed through the chamber, steady but stained with guilt, as he explained how Olivia had masterminded harassment campaigns designed to force the sale of Harold's ranch. The jury leaned forward when he described the plans to poison the water supply. The words landed like hammers on steel. Premeditated sabotage, targeted intimidation, federal conspiracy. Then came the footage. My footage. Harold's foresight had given us a gift. High-definition cameras capturing Olivia's hired men cutting fences, muttering about starting near the cemetery. The jury flinched when they heard those words, when they realized she'd ordered destruction of graves to break me. And finally, the texts. Projected on a giant screen, each one was another nail in her coffin. Property correction crew working today. Do not interfere. Begin with cemetery sections. Her own digital fingerprints, written with the arrogance of someone who believed the law bent to her will. The defense tried to argue harassment, not conspiracy. Overreach, not crime. But every time they spoke, the evidence slammed back harder. The residents of Meadowbrook filled the gallery, shoulder to shoulder, silent witnesses to their own vindication. Ella sat in the front row, folder clutched in her lap, jaw tight with determination. Behind her, Jim Foster whispered to neighbors about restitution. Tom Bradley flipped through building codes, ready to dismantle any lie. And then came the moment I'll never forget. Attorney Chen played the video of Olivia at Harold's memorial, the live stream. The courtroom watched her shove against me, screaming about non-compliance, planting her flag beside my grandfather's grave. Her voice rang out. "This is HOA-maintained property now." Gasps filled the chamber. A juror covered her mouth. Another shook his head in disbelief. Even the judge's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward. "Miss Sharp," he said, voice low but sharp, "did you truly believe you had the authority to desecrate a family memorial?" For the first time, Olivia faltered. Her voice cracked as she mumbled something about community guidelines. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Guidelines, as if paper rules justified desecration. When closing arguments came, Attorney Chen's words cut deep. "This is not a case about neighborhood disputes," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "This is about a woman who weaponized authority, fabricated laws, stole from her community, and attempted to destroy a family legacy for profit. It is about arrogance dressed as leadership, and it is about justice." The jury left for deliberation. Less than 2 hours later, they returned, guilty on every count. Fraud, conspiracy, harassment, false impersonation of government authority, assault, theft of community funds. The list was long enough to echo. When the judge pronounced her sentence, 2 years in federal prison, 5 years probation, restitution payments, permanent ban from HOA leadership, Olivia finally broke. The mask cracked, her lips trembled, and for the first time since she stormed into Harold's study, she looked small. But justice wasn't just about her. The community had already begun rebuilding. Ella, now the official coordinator, announced plans to restore transparency, return stolen funds, and protect residents from ever facing tyranny disguised as bylaws again. Jim uncovered every cent of missing money, ready to funnel restitution back into the neighborhood. Tom drafted reforms that would strip HOA boards of unchecked power. And me, I stood outside the courthouse looking at reporters, cameras flashing. I wasn't just speaking as Harold's grandson. I was speaking as someone who'd learned what power looks like when it corrupts. Legacy doesn't belong to paper pushers, I told them. It belongs to families, to neighbors, to the communities who protect one another, not prey on one another. And that's what this fight was about. Behind me, Meadowbrook residents stood together, united in a way Olivia could never have imagined. They weren't victims anymore. They were victors. And yet, even as the crowd cheered, even as Olivia was led away in chains, a quiet truth pressed heavy against my heart. Battles end in courtrooms, but wars end in memory. And I knew Harold's ranch would carry this story for generations. Autumn sunlight poured across the pastures like a blessing, golden and quiet, as if the land itself was finally exhaling after years of holding its breath. For the first time since Harold's passing, the ranch felt at peace. The fences stood strong again, posts rooted deeper than before. The family cemetery, once threatened by greed, now carried a plaque designating it a protected heritage site under state law. No clipboard, no bylaw, no compliance officer could ever touch it again. Olivia Sharp was gone, locked in a federal cell, stripped of every title, every illusion of power. Her smirk had faded the moment the judge handed down lifetime bans, restitution orders, and the kind of sentence that doesn't just punish, it erases. The HOA she'd ruled like a kingdom had been dissolved, its money restored to the neighbors she'd bled dry. Her name would be remembered not as a leader, but as a warning. But what rose from her ashes mattered more than her downfall. Meadowbrook, once silent and divided, had transformed. Neighbors who barely nodded at one another now shared coffee on porches, planted gardens side by side, flew flags without fear. Ella Dawson, the teacher who once stood trembling against Olivia's fines, now stood tall as the community's new coordinator. Her first act wasn't issuing notices, it was issuing apologies. "This neighborhood belongs to its people, not to any one person's clipboard," she told them, and her words carried more weight than any bylaw ever written. Jim Foster balanced the books, calculating every dollar stolen, every cent returned. Tom Bradley walked door to door explaining reforms, promising that no rule could ever again be invented out of thin air. And together they built something stronger than regulations: trust. Even the state took notice. The legislature passed what they called the Harold Grant Protection Act, a law ensuring no HOA could fabricate authority, steal funds, or harass families under false pretenses again. What began as one man defending his grandfather's land became a blueprint for protecting homeowners across the nation. Other governors called, eager to replicate the law. Harold's ranch had become more than a farm. It had become a symbol. The memorial service we'd tried and failed to hold finally came together on a crisp autumn afternoon. More than 200 people gathered. Family, neighbors, state officials, agricultural groups, all standing beneath the shade of Harold's oak tree. The same tree Olivia once wanted trimmed down now stood taller than ever, its branches sheltering generations past and future. Ella stepped forward with a plaque carved in bronze. "Governor Grant," she said, her voice steady, "our community owes your family an apology, and Harold owes our gratitude. This land doesn't just feed cattle, it feeds dignity. Today, we honor that." The plaque was placed beside Harold's bench, not as property, not as compliance, but as memory. A promise that the man who'd built fences, raised cattle, and defended heritage would never be erased. I sat on that bench as the sun slipped low, shadows stretching across 6 generations of pasture. The oak swayed overhead, and in the quiet I could almost hear Harold's laugh, see the way he'd lean on his cane, his eyes sharp as the horizon. He'd prepared for this fight long before I arrived. The documents in his safe, the cameras on his fences, the wisdom in his sayings, they weren't just protection. They were faith. Faith that the family would endure. And endure we had. As the last guests drifted away, I walked the fence line one more time. The wood was new, but the soil beneath was old, rich, loyal. I touched each post as if shaking hands with Harold himself, thanking him for the foresight, the stubbornness, the legacy. Back inside the ranch house, I opened Harold's safe once more. Inside, I placed the final papers, signed legislation, preservation orders, restitution checks, and photographs from the trial. I locked them away, sealing not just history, but victory. Future generations would inherit not just land, but proof that legacies can outlast corruption. That night I stood on the porch, stars spilling across the sky. No headlights on the road, No trespassers at the fence, just silence deep and clean. And as the wind rustled through the oak, I whispered, "Justice took its time, grandfather, but when it came, it was complete." Maybe the real lesson wasn't about fences or bylaws or even property rights. Maybe it was about legacy, because legacy doesn't crumble under corruption, it exposes it. Legacy doesn't bend under tyranny, it resists it. Legacy doesn't fade when threatened, it shines brighter until even the darkest neighbor can't help but see. And as long as Harold's ranch stood, that legacy would never die. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one, the truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.